Welcome to Deposit Your Doubt. This isn't a space of judgment, but a sanctuary for spiritual exploration. Here, your questions aren't threats to faith, they're invitations to deeper understanding. I'm Krystal, and I've learned that our most profound moments of spiritual growth often bloom in the uncertain terrain between what we know and what we're still discovering. Every doubt you carry is welcome here. Every wrestling match with belief is sacred. This podcast is your soft landing, your grace-filled conversation, your reminder that questioning doesn't mean breaking, it means becoming. If you are just joining me in this space, a very special welcome to you. My last episode really set up what this podcast is all about. I have come to several places in my life where I questioned what God was doing, and I doubted that He would show up for me. And it wasn't because I didn't believe in Him, but it was simply because I'm human. And it's normal to be challenged through your life circumstances. Life is hard. It's difficult to reason why certain things happen to you or to those that you love. And oftentimes, if you believe God will take care of all of it, in the middle of tough things, it's easy to question His certainty. I told you before that I have come to the conclusion that questioning God does not diminish His majesty or who He is. Questioning God does not change how He feels about you or me. And I believe that questioning God leads to deeper intimacy with Him. I only came to these conclusions from lived experience. Growing up, I never imagined my faith would be so challenged. The home I grew up in permeated with the abiding faith of God. It was beautiful. If my parents did not always feel the solidity of God's foundation, that was not what they portrayed to me and my brother. I grew up knowing that in every moment, God takes care of you. In all circumstances, He is there to support you. With that foundation as a child, I developed a glass half full mentality about really everything. I would have experiences along the way, though, through high school and college that would definitely cause my glass to wobble. Things would start to push hard on me in ways that I had never experienced, but there would be one thing in my adult life that would topple all of this, and it would completely spill my half full glass. And honestly, it almost broke it. As much as I really don't want to relive this, I have to tell you the one experience I had that drove these points home that I mentioned above. It drove them home to the point where I feel them in the deepest parts of my soul. When I tell you that I fully believe that when I question God, it doesn't diminish His majesty, it's because I experienced it. When I tell you that my doubts about Him and what He's doing did not change how He felt about me, it's because I experienced it. I want you to hear this story. I want you to know how I got to the place where I am now, where I'm not afraid to question God. I'm not afraid to say how I truly feel, and I'm not too shy to show up as my real self in my relationship with the Lord. My vulnerability in my relationship with God is what keeps me connected to Him. My faith would truly be tested and honestly attempted to be taken away from me. All of this would happen in the middle of a cold apartment in Kiev, Ukraine. I need to preface this story by saying I never thought that I would be a mom. It was just not something that I dreamed about. I thought that I would love to get married one day, but I just never really thought about having kids. And so everything that has followed in my life is such a surprise, not just to me, but to my parents. And my husband was very similar. He just didn't really know if he wanted to have kids. But one day he said to me, just out of the blue, if I was ever going to have kids, I think that I would adopt. That's what I always imagined. And when I tell this story to other people, I say that something about those words lit a fire in me that I didn't really know could exist. And that's what put us on this trajectory to adopt a child. We lost a few adoptions in the beginning, just following different paths, and each of them carry with them their own tragedy. And it would just take hours for me to talk through every single thing that happened. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about all of the tragedy that happened at the end. It was a lot of trauma, a couple years of just extreme trauma, trying to get to the point where we brought a child home. And eventually, we were going to adopt a little girl that was in Ukraine. There's going to be aspects of her story that I don't dive into here for safety reasons for her and also for us. There are parts of the story that are really difficult for me to talk about. And I'm going to talk about some of that today. And honestly, it's stuff that I don't drudge up very often because of all the waterworks that you are going to hear. Hard to get through. But back in 2014, my husband and I had gone to Ukraine to adopt a little girl. We knew her relatively well. She had spent 10 weeks in our home over various trips to the United States. There was a program that we were a part of and that we knew about that would bring orphans to the United States. And so we had gotten to know her the best that we could in 10 weeks, and we were on the trip to bring her home. And if you've ever adopted a child or you've been through that process, specifically internationally, but I know that domestic adoptions can be similar, the amount of paperwork that you have to fill out is just astounding. It's all important. It all makes sense when you go through the process, why you would have to do so much paperwork, so many background checks, so many things, but it's exhausting. And so I had been through all of that. I had not only been through just her paperwork to get to her, which was extensive and exhausting. I had lost 2 adoptions prior to her that I had done all the paperwork for as well. So it was a lot. It was hard. I was tired. We get on the plane to go to Kiev and just almost immediately fell asleep. It was like my body was just done with this entire thing. And somewhere in between being awake and in reality and then falling asleep, I had this feeling that I've never felt before. And it was just like, almost like I was flying into some sort of extreme danger zone. It was weird. It was almost like I was flying into this other realm where it was going to be a fight. And I didn't quite understand that. I didn't have all the tools or the knowledge at the time to understand what that would mean. But it just kind of felt like I was flying to the fight of my life. And that's exactly what ended up happening. When we landed there, on the way to our apartment, we passed a bunch of militant activity on the side of the road. Just 3 months before we stepped foot in Ukraine, Russia had begun to invade the border. And it was really interesting. You didn't quite think that you would feel that activity everywhere, but you did, all the way to the capital. And so as we're driving to our apartment, on the side of the road, I saw these militants all dressed in black with assault rifles. And there were several of them pointing their guns at someone that they were trying to shove in the back of a car. Now, I want you to imagine, this is my first image upon arriving there. It was terrifying. It was terrifying. And you had no idea. You're like, I'm not exposed to this in my normal life. But this was normal life. It was broad daylight. And this was happening. So here we are. This particular thing happens. And we go and we receive all the files to go see our daughter. And everything seemed like it was going fine. And then someone from the agency on that side of things, so someone from the agency there in Ukraine, asked us if we had ever heard of her uncle. And no one had ever mentioned an uncle to us. No one had ever mentioned any family, honestly. And so we didn't know who this was, but she said that he was going to show up because he wanted to meet us. And with the impending war that was happening, he just wanted to make sure she was okay. What ensued was a lot. When I really get into the details of what happened to us, which I just can't do here, But when I get into the details of the following days, it's a miracle that my husband and I were not harmed while we were there. It's a miracle that we made it home the way that we did. But we show up to adopt this little girl. When we find her at the orphanage, she is drugged out of her mind. She's scared of us. We discover later that they had sort of been brainwashing her against us, telling her all of these things to make her scared of us so that she wouldn't go home with us. And that was terrifying, just to find her in that state. And then you're trying to figure out, what does this mean? What happens? And then this big orchestrated thing happened where her uncle shows up and he comes thundering through a door. She's cowering behind me because she's really scared. And he barks a bunch of things in Russian, and she rushes behind him. She rushes from behind me to behind him, and she's terrified. Now, I don't speak Russian well. I know just a couple of things, enough to get me by, especially on a trip to Ukraine. But that day, I understood almost everything that was being said to me. And he proceeded to tell us that he was going to take her to Siberia. She was going to be raised by her aunt, and she was not coming to America. I mean, you just feel like you're in a dream. We came here with one goal, and that was to take her home. And now what's happening? This man who claims that he's an uncle is going to take her from us. She's terrified. I can see that she's terrified. And I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't save her. I didn't know what to do. I was left powerless. There was a lot of things that happened that day that were supposedly coincidences, but I really think they were pretty orchestrated. The day that all of this happened, we were sort of abandoned by the agency on the ground. There was no one there with us that day as representation to stop what was happening. And that was by design. It was kind of always meant and that it was going to happen this way. We were sort of guinea pigs, but we didn't realize it. And so I obtained all of the paperwork that I possibly could and tried to get the custody paperwork that he received, because he got custody of her. And within 48 hours, he had her out of the country. They knew that he had her out of the country because her passport had been scanned. And so you're just left shell-shocked in the middle of this country that you don't know, a middle of a country that you don't necessarily feel very safe in, and the whole reason that you're there is gone. I was fortunate that at the time my father-in-law was a U.S. congressman, and it just so happened that Ukraine was in his portfolio of work on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and so he was able to get me some meetings with different people in Washington, D.C., just to be sure that she had not been trafficked, because that was really what I thought had happened, that she had been trafficked in front of my eyes. Come to find out, he really was an uncle. He did show up to take her. And there are 3 stories that I live with. I live with the story of what our government found out about her and where they believed that she was. We have the story of what her government believes happened to her and happened to us. And then I have what's in my heart. And spoiler alert, these are 3 very different realities. And so what do you do in a situation like that? When literally, physically, your daughter is taken from you. Just taken. You don't know where she is. You have no idea if she's alive. You just don't know what's going to happen to her. And when God calls you to adopt a child, it's so similar to when you have your own child. You feel this dedication to this life. They are your responsibility. You're supposed to take care of them. You're supposed to make sure that they are okay, that they have everything that they need. And in a situation like this, it's all out of your control. There's nothing that you can do. I had several moments in the wake of losing her that really would begin to shape my relationship with the Lord in a new phase. As you live your life and as you go about things, your relationship with the Lord changes. It ebbs and it flows because you are maturing and your relationship with him is doing the same. And so there was a few moments, a couple of them in Ukraine and a couple of them once we got home, that were just these markers in the ground for me. One was the day that she was taken from us in the orphanage. My husband and I ended up back in our apartment that was in her home city where she was. And I looked at him and I felt like it was the first time I had looked at him in years. I had had my head down in paperwork trying to bring a child home. And I looked at him, my heart bleeding, my head pounding. And I felt like the Lord said, look at him. Look at what I've given you in this man. You may feel like you have lost something, but look how much you have. And it was this beautiful moment where we could recognize in one another that even though we had lost something that was extremely precious to us, we still had each other. And God still had a plan for us. He had a plan for our marriage. So thankful for that moment because it would be this buoy that would continue to tie me back to reality, because I was going to go through some really hard times in my mind and in my walk with the Lord. I remember being home for just a little while after this trip, and as you can imagine, coming home was really, really hard because we had a bedroom completely set up for her. A lot of her stuff that she asked me to keep, it was all in that room. And coming back, I had trouble wanting to look at that room. It just seemed impossible. And I remember there being one day that I just really couldn't get out of our bed. I was in the bed, and at the time we had these like pretty sheer curtains in our bedroom, and they were pulled, so there was like a little bit of light coming through. And I felt like God said, "Get up. You need to get up." And so I got out of bed and I went over to those curtains to try to open them. And when I did, this wave of grief just crashed over me and I fell down. And I don't even know how long I was sitting there, but I was just sobbing. And then I said out loud, "I think I'm losing my faith." And for a girl that has been so firm in her faith, who has believed so wholeheartedly in the goodness of God and in the fact that he will take care of you no matter what was happening to me and what had happened to this little girl was not something that I could reconcile with the God that I claimed to know and love. Every single thing that had transpired, I couldn't reconcile with him. There was no way that God would do this. There was no way that he would allow this. And if so, who is he? Who is this person that I told the world I believed in? How could he allow the most vulnerable of a person to be taken from me when I was the safest thing that she had ever experienced? What kind of God does this? I was wrecked. And even telling you this story now is really difficult, as you can tell. I tell it easier these days, believe it or not. That actually was pretty easy. But even then, it's so hard. It's the hardest thing I've ever lived through. And it's not so difficult because the experience in Ukraine was so dramatic and traumatic. It's difficult because it never ends. There's no resolution. What do you do with a God who won't resolve things for you? How can you stand firm in your faith if the very thing that you think God called you to, he rips from under you? I had so much trouble reconciling this, and even when he began to show me glimpses of the possible why he did this, it was still hard to swallow the reality. There are many things that I gained because God took this little girl from me. And that is so hard for me to say. But had I not pursued her, I wouldn't have been willing to pursue another adoption. which ultimately for us, it led us to our son. And had she come home, her trauma would have forced us to not have any more children because she needed every ounce of my husband and me to heal. I've been able to see these things as time has gone on, and I understand a little bit of the why God did this. I would be lying to you if I didn't say that it crosses my mind a few times a week to question God on this. Where is she, Lord? Her chances to survive were slim. Why did you do that? Why are you allowing war where I think that she is? Is she alive? Did she make it? Has anyone hurt her? Because I feel like she was my daughter, these questions are impossible to navigate. I have simply had to come to a place where I know that God sees what I can't see. I know that He knows what I can't know. And He knows my humanity cannot calculate the cost of this entire endeavor. He knows my humanity will cause me to question Him and doubt His goodness because of the loss I have experienced. I mentioned last time that this circumstance was where I realized I could stand in front of God and beat on His chest with frustration, and He wouldn't move. He stood there as I screamed and I threw my arms, and He took it. He knows I hurt. He knows that I don't understand. And once I realized I could do this, I could scream and I could shout and I could be so mad at Him. Once my fit subsided, I opened my very blurry eyes, and He was still standing there. He had not left me. He had not judged me. He was still God, and He loved me. When we come back, I will talk about what I think God is wanting to show us through the experiences that we just can't reconcile. Stay tuned. Ever feel like your phone bill is eating up your budget? That was us, until we found Mint Mobile. I remember staring at those monthly wireless bills thinking there had to be a better way. Spoiler alert, there is. When our family switched to Mint Mobile, it completely changed our perspective on what mobile service should cost. What makes Mint different? They deliver the same premium wireless experience you expect, but without the premium price tag. The coverage is reliable, the service is stellar, and the savings? Let's just say my wallet is significantly happier these days. Customers can get their first month absolutely free when they sign up for the 3-month 5GB plan. Plus, using my referral link gets you an extra $15 credit towards your renewal. That's like finding money in your pocket. Who doesn't love that? Think about what you could do with the money you save. Maybe it's that fancy coffee you've been eyeing, or that new book you've been wanting to grab. Whatever it is, it's yours to keep instead of throwing it at an overpriced phone bill. Need to make the switch? Just head to the link in our episode description. Take it from someone who's been there. Mint Mobile delivers quality wireless service without the painful price tag. Don't wait to start saving. Check out Mint Mobile today and see why so many people are making the switch to smarter wireless. Before the break, I told you the story of my absolute lowest point. The one place where I felt like I was about to let go of my faith for the first time in my whole life. And that circumstance has led me here, to a place where I have found God more in my questions and doubts than I ever knew possible. Podcast is an invitation for you to bring your most questionable life events, your most questionable responses to those events, and all the doubts you have about God's goodness. I want you to bring them to this podcast and hold them while you listen. God will reveal Himself to you and show you what to do with the uncertainty. He knows how you feel. He knows how angry or hurt or sad you are. He knows and He loves you, and He will use what has happened to you to make you into who He designed you to be. And He will use it to bring you closer into relationship with Him. I know this because that's what He did with me from that terrible circumstance in Ukraine, and He continues to do it. This is not something that has already happened in me. It's something that He's constantly doing. My glass, my half-full glass that I carried around my whole life, fell over that day. And if I'm honest, it cracked a little. And I can't fix that, and that's okay. But now it holds more water than it ever used to. It feels fuller than it ever did. And all of that happened because it spilled and God had to fill it up again. As you walk away today, I want you to ponder these theological insights. So pause here to get a pen to write this down, or grab the notes on your phone so that you can dictate this. The insights that I am going to give you today are grounded in what theologians call the already, not yet tension of faith. It's where we live between God's promises and their ultimate fulfillment. When things are stripped away, we're invited to discover whether we love God's gifts more than God himself, similar to what David experienced when he wrote in Psalm 27, "When my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." So I'm going to share these insights on wrestling with unresolved circumstances and apparent contradictions in our relationship with God. That is what I wrestled with in the story that I told you today. So the first thing is, the mystery of God's sovereignty often requires lament and trust. Scripture shows us that expressing raw emotions to God while maintaining faith is deeply spiritual. Job, after losing everything, proclaimed, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." You can find that in Job 13:15. And the Psalms are filled with honest laments like, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" in Psalm 13:1. Psalms are such a good example where we start with these honest laments, but then we end with declarations of trust. It requires both lament and trust. This teaches us that faith isn't about having all the answers, but it's about maintaining relationship through uncertainty. The second thing I want you to notice is God's purpose often works through apparent contradictions. Consider Abraham. He was promised a son, and then he was asked to sacrifice Isaac, Genesis 22. I feel so closely to Abraham because of what I went through with our daughter. Or think about Joseph's dreams of leadership leading him to slavery and imprisonment, Genesis 37 through 50. The pattern that we see is that God's promises often take unexpected paths to fulfillment. And this requires us to trust his character rather than our interpretation of his methods. As Isaiah 55:8 through 9 state, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours." I always say that trusting his character is the thing that will stand the test of time. So we have to trust that over what we interpret his methods are. And then the last thing I want you to see is that spiritual formation often happens in the void. When Paul prayed 3 times for his thorn in the flesh to be removed, God's response wasn't removal, but he said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This was in 2 Corinthians 12:9. This suggests that sometimes God's highest purpose isn't resolving our circumstances, but transforming us through them. I want you to think about that. Sometimes God's highest purpose isn't resolving our circumstances, but transforming us through them. Like the Israelites in the wilderness, that's a good example. The journey itself is part of the formation process. No, for me, that has been my experience. It has been my experience that his purpose is not always taking away something. It's not always resolving something because I feel deep unresolved things in my life. But I know that through those circumstances, he has transformed me. He's made me into someone that I never imagined I was. I want you to remember that God is not intimidated by your questions. He's big enough to handle your doubts, and he's tender enough to hold your heart while you work through them. So instead of pushing the feelings down, I want to encourage you to bring them to the light. Take them to God, sit with them, let him meet you right there in this vulnerable place. Until next time, keep being brave enough to ask the hard questions, gentle enough with yourself to acknowledge your struggles, and open enough to let God surprise you with his answers. This episode resonated with you? Remember to subscribe, share with someone you know who might need to hear it, and leave a review. It helps other seekers find our little community. Thanks for listening today. If you're looking for more encouragement between episodes, I've written a few books that might be just what you need for your journey. Find them all at krystalrebel.com.
This podcast is produced by Told You So Media.
Told you so!